Daniel Grayson looked like nothing more than a quiet recluse living at the edge of town, but behind the locked doors of his shed, he built a hidden world of horror so convincing that even when the police stood inside it, they had no idea they were standing in the middle of a killer's secrets. The farmhouse at the edge of the woods had always been a place that drew suspicion, though no one in the town could ever explain exactly why. It wasn't falling apart or abandoned, but it carried a sense of unease, as though its walls had soaked up something unspoken. The man who lived there, Daniel Grayson, hardly interacted with anyone. He was not unfriendly, but he had perfected the art of being invisible. He went to town only when necessary, never lingering long enough for conversation, and always returned with supplies stacked in his truck bed. People noticed the way he avoided eye contact, the way his expression never shifted beyond a faint half-smile. For many, Daniel was simply part of the background of their lives, a quiet presence tucked away in the forest, and yet whispers grew louder about what he kept behind his home. The shed was larger than most barns in the area, but unlike others filled with tractors, tools, or hay, Daniel's was locked at all times. Chains wound tightly around the door and heavy bolts secured it shut, even in broad daylight. At night, strange sounds traveled from the shed to the nearby road. Some swore they heard banging, others described metallic scraping, and a few even claimed to catch muffled cries carried by the wind. Those stories were often laughed off, attributed to coyotes or the clatter of branches in the storm, but deep down, everyone knew there was something unusual about Daniel's shed. Children dared each other to approach it but never got close, always turning back when the silence pressed too heavily on their ears. The first real hint of fear came when travelers began vanishing from the county. A hitchhiker disappeared just days after being spotted near the forest trail. A young couple on a road trip was never seen again after their car was found parked not far from Daniel's property. Although the police investigated, no link was ever made to Daniel. He had mastered the art of appearing harmless, and suspicion never landed squarely on him. The shed remained locked, standing like a sentinel guarding secrets that no one wanted to face. The strange smells that drifted from it at night, an acrid mixture of bleach and something metallic, were dismissed as cleaning supplies or farm work. For the townsfolk, life carried on with Daniel tucked away in his corner, but the truth was that the heart of terror sat right there on the edge of town, hidden behind chains and shadows. Daniel Grayson's past was a puzzle with missing pieces, and the few fragments that surfaced only made him more mysterious. Years before, he had worked in a butcher shop on the far side of the county, where his skill with knives was unmatched. Customers admired how quickly he carved through bone and muscle with almost surgical precision. But then, one day, he simply walked out and never returned. The shop owner said Daniel left his apron folded neatly on the counter without a word of explanation. From that moment, he disappeared for nearly 10 years. No forwarding address, no job history, no friends to account for his time. When he finally returned and purchased the old farmhouse, people quietly wondered how he had the money, but no one dared ask. The shed was the centerpiece of his property. Oversized and industrial in its construction, it didn't match the farmhouse's rustic design. The walls were made of reinforced wood, the windows painted black so no one could see inside. Heavy padlocks and chains decorated the doors, and motion lights flickered on if anyone got too close. When delivery drivers asked where to unload supplies, Daniel always met them at the driveway, refusing to let anyone near the backyard. He explained it away with vague excuses about valuable equipment, but the intensity in his tone kept most people from pressing further. Over time, whispers became stories, and stories turned into warnings. Parents told their children to avoid cutting across Daniel's land. Teenagers, fueled by dares, crept up to the edge of the property but never stayed long, unnerved by the eerie silence that always seemed to surround the shed. Some claimed they saw Daniel dragging heavy sacks into it under the cover of night. Others described strange stains on the ground near his truck, dark spots that looked too much like blood. Still, nothing concrete tied him to anything sinister. Meanwhile, the list of missing people grew. A drifter passing through town, a college student traveling alone, a truck driver whose route ended abruptly near the forest. One by one, they vanished without explanation. Investigators searched wooded trails and riverbanks, but each search came up empty. Daniel's name never surfaced officially in reports. Though his shed remained the silent answer everyone avoided. For the town, suspicion lingered like smoke in the air, but without proof, no one could act. Daniel lived on undisturbed, perfecting his routines, while behind the locked doors of the shed, the missing left behind a truth far darker than anyone imagined. The night the police arrived at Daniel Grayson's property was one of those stormy evenings when even the bravest townsfolk stayed indoors. The rain pounded heavily on the farmhouse roof, and flashes of lightning illuminated the thick forest around it. A call had been made to the local station, reporting strange noises coming from the direction of the shed. Shouts, banging, and what one neighbor swore sounded like someone begging for help. With the disappearances still unsolved, the police couldn't ignore the complaint. 2 patrol cars rolled up the long dirt driveway, tires sinking into the mud, their headlights sweeping across the looming figure of the shed. Daniel met them on the porch, calm and polite, his voice steady, as he greeted the officers. He explained that the storm had loosened parts of the shed roof, and the noises were likely from loose panels clattering in the wind. His story sounded reasonable, and his demeanor made it difficult to suspect otherwise. Still, the officers insisted on looking. With the kind of calmness that can only come from long practice, Daniel reached for the chains and unlocked the shed himself, each bolt clicking open as though rehearsed 100 times. Inside, the officers found a scene carefully staged to appear ordinary. Wooden crates stacked neatly in one corner, shelves lined with jars and canned goods, tools hung perfectly on the walls. A workbench stood near the back, with scraps of wood and half-finished carvings, as if Daniel spent his nights building furniture. The sharp scent of bleach was unmistakable, but Daniel explained it away as routine cleaning. The officers glanced at each other but said nothing. They saw nothing out of place, at least nothing that screamed of criminal activity. To them, it looked like an eccentric man's oversized workshop. What they didn't realize was that just beneath their boots, hidden under a layer of plywood and covered by crates, lay the hatch to a soundproof cellar. Down there were the answers to every missing person in the county, their belongings lined up in grotesque order and Daniel's journals detailing his every move. But the officers, blind to the horror below, made their inspection brief. They noted the storm damage, reminded Daniel to secure his property, and left without further suspicion. As their patrol cars disappeared down the road, Daniel exhaled for the first time that night, a thin smile creeping across his face. The police had stood inside his murder shed and walked out none the wiser. When the red and blue lights finally vanished into the storm, Daniel's body sagged against the shed door. For a man who had mastered composure, the visit had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. He knew how close the officers had been to uncovering everything. Beneath the crates that looked so harmless, beneath the wooden floor they had casually walked across, the cellar pulsed with secrets that could never see the light of day. Down there, the air was heavy with the smell of iron and bleach, a space carved deliberately to hold what no one was ever meant to find. Bloodstains streaked the concrete walls despite Daniel's endless scrubbing. Shelves sagged under the weight of trophies, watches, wallets, jewelry, scraps of clothing neatly folded. Each piece told the story of someone who never made it home, each belonging cataloged in Daniel's journals with chilling precision. He moved quickly once the police were gone. The crates were pushed back into place, the hatch locked tight with its concealed latch, and the bleach was poured again to cover the faint trace of what lingered. His hands shook as he wrote that night's entry in his journal, noting the time the officers arrived, the questions they asked, and how convincingly he had smiled through it all. The journals weren't just records. They were confessions written in detail no sane person would ever put to paper. But for Daniel, they were a reminder of control, a way to relive what he had done. Still, the visit had left him rattled. He realized how fragile his setup had become. The bleach smell was harder to disguise. The noises were harder to explain. The storm had nearly betrayed him. In the silence that followed, he paced the cellar, running his hands over the bolted door as though reassuring himself it was still sealed. He burned old rags, dismantled broken tools, and gathered bones into sacks that he planned to scatter farther into the forest. Every movement was fueled by the fear that someone would come back, this time looking harder. Yet beneath that fear was arrogance. Daniel believed his performance had been flawless, that the officers had left with no suspicion at all. He saw himself as untouchable, a man clever enough to stand inches away from exposure and still walk free. As he secured the shed one final time that night, his thin smile returned. He thought he had beaten them, unaware that the seeds of his downfall had already been planted, waiting quietly to grow. The weeks that followed the storm were uneasy for Daniel Grayson. He resumed his routines, driving into town for supplies, nodding politely at the clerk, retreating back to his farmhouse without lingering. To the outside world, he seemed unchanged, but inside the shed he worked frantically. The police visit haunted him like a shadow he couldn't shake. He reinforced the cellar door, poured more bleach across the floor, and even built false compartments to throw off any curious eyes. Yet paranoia began to gnaw at him. He started sleeping less, checking the locks on his shed again and again, convinced someone would return. The journals that once brought him comfort now looked like evidence waiting to destroy him, but he couldn't bring himself to burn them. They were his trophies, just as precious as the belongings of his victims. His arrogance nearly saved him. He told himself the officers had believed every word, that the storm had been his ally, that the noises had been explained away. But arrogance has a way of making men careless. A neighbor, already suspicious, installed a small security camera pointed toward the road. At first, it captured nothing unusual. But then, night after night, it recorded Daniel dragging heavy sacks from his truck into the shed. Some nights, the sacks dripped dark liquid, staining the dirt. When the neighbor turned the footage over to police, the pieces of a much larger puzzle began to take shape. Investigators returned, but this time they came prepared. A warrant in hand, they forced Daniel aside when he tried to stall them with his usual calm explanations. The shed was torn apart, crates shifted, plywood pried loose. At last, the hatch was uncovered, its metal latch glinting under the beam of a flashlight. What the officers found below silenced even the most hardened among them. The cellar stretched wide and deep, walls smeared with blood that had seeped into the concrete, shelves lined with rows of belongings belonging to the missing, and in one corner, sacks half filled with bones. The journals lay stacked neatly, page after page of chilling detail. Daniel was caught attempting to flee the next morning, his truck packed with supplies and fuel. He was arrested without a struggle, his thin smile finally gone. For the community, the discovery was both a relief and a horror. The shed that had been dismissed as eccentric, the man who had seemed invisible, had both stood at the center of their worst nightmares. The memory that lingered most with the police was not what they found in the cellar, but the haunting realization that weeks earlier, they had walked inside his murder shed and left without ever knowing.